Scott never imagined that the hardest part of his day would not be the morning rush. It would not be the cold coffee he never had time to finish. It would not even be dropping his 6-year-old daughter, Lily, at school while she cried and begged him not to go. The hardest part was walking through those glass doors every single morning and feeling Morgan's eyes land on him like a judgment he had not yet earned. She never smiled at him. She never nodded. She simply watched, the way someone watches a problem they have not yet decided how to solve. Scott was good at his job. He knew that. His numbers proved it. His late nights proved it. But none of that seemed to matter to Morgan. To her, he was already behind. And the worst part? He had no idea why. If you have ever felt invisible in a place where you gave everything, you already know exactly how Scott felt. Scott had a system. It was not a perfect system, but it was his and it worked most days. He woke up at 5:30 every morning. He made Lily's lunch before she even opened her eyes. He laid her clothes on the edge of her bed, tied in a neat little pile, because she liked choosing which socks to wear last. It was the one decision she got to make before the world started moving too fast for either of them. By 6:15, he was dressed. By 6:40, Lily was in the car. By 7:10, she was at school. By 7:45, Scott was at his desk with a cup of coffee that was already going cold. He had it timed down to the minute. But life does not care about minutes. It was a Tuesday when the system first broke. Lily woke up at 4 in the morning, burning with fever. She called for him in that small, frightened voice that no father in the world can ignore. Scott was at her bedside before he was even fully awake. He pressed his hand to her forehead and felt his stomach drop. He spent the next 2 hours on the floor of her bedroom, a damp cloth in his hand, watching her chest rise and fall and silently making deals with the universe. By morning, Lily's fever had come down, but Scott had not slept. His eyes were heavy, his shirt was wrinkled, and he was 40 minutes late to a meeting that Morgan had personally scheduled. He slipped into the conference room as quietly as he could. Morgan looked up from the head of the table. She did not say a word. She did not have to. The way her eyes moved from the clock on the wall to Scott's face said everything she chose not to speak out loud. Scott took his seat. He opened his laptop. He tried to focus. But he could feel her watching him for the rest of the meeting like a question she had already decided the answer to. Afterward, she stopped him in the hallway. "This is the second time this month," she said. Her voice was calm, controlled, the kind of calm that is somehow colder than anger. Scott nodded. "I know. I apologize. My daughter was sick and I need people I can count on, Scott." She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. "I need people who show up." She walked away before he could respond. And Scott stood there in that hallway, holding his laptop against his chest, feeling something he had not felt since the early days of doing this alone. He felt ashamed. Not because he was wrong, but because no matter how hard he tried, it never felt like enough. Not at home. Not here. Not anywhere. That night, he sat at Lily's bedside long after she had fallen asleep. He watched her breathe. He smoothed the blanket over her small shoulders. And he thought about Morgan's words. "I need people who show up," and how deeply unfair it was to hear them from someone who had never once had to choose between a sick child and a calendar. He thought about quitting. He thought about it seriously, the way tired people do. Not dramatically, but quietly, like blowing out a candle. But then Lily shifted in her sleep and reached for his hand without waking up. And Scott stayed. Because that was what he did. He stayed. If the story is already pulling at something in your chest, hit that like button. You have no idea where this is going. YET.IT was a Thursday night when everything shifted. Not dramatically. Not with a grand gesture or a perfectly timed confession. It shifted the way most real things do, quietly, in a moment neither of them planned for and neither of them would forget. The office was empty by 8 o'clock. The lights in the open floor had dimmed to their automatic evening setting, casting everything in a soft, tired glow. Most of the team had gone home hours ago. The cleaning crew had already come and gone. Even the hum of the building felt different at this hour, slower, like the whole place was exhaling. Scott was still at his desk. He had a presentation due first thing Friday morning. A client proposal that had taken him 3 weeks to build and still did not feel ready. He had sent Lily to his mother's for the night, which was its own kind of guilt, the specific, sharp guilt of a parent who sometimes needs to be somewhere else. He told himself he would leave by 9. He told himself that every night. He was deep inside a spreadsheet when he heard it. A sound so small he almost missed it. A sharp, quiet breath, the kind a person makes when they are trying very hard not to cry. Scott looked up. Morgan was sitting alone in her glass-walled office at the far end of the floor. She had not turned her office light on. She was sitting in the blue glow of her computer screen, perfectly still, one hand pressed flat against her desk like she was steadying herself against something invisible. Scott looked away. It was not his business. She was his boss. She had made it very clear over the past several months exactly what kind of relationship they had, professional, distant, and entirely on her terms. He looked back at his spreadsheet. He lasted about 4 minutes. He told himself he was going to the kitchen for water. That was all. He was thirsty. It had nothing to do with the way she had looked sitting alone in the dark. He filled his glass. He stood at the kitchen counter for a moment. And then, without fully deciding to, he walked to her office doorway and knocked softly on the open door. Morgan looked up fast. Her expression snapped closed like a book she had not meant to leave open. She straightened in her chair. She blinked twice. "Scott." Her voice was steady, almost convincing. "I thought everyone had gone home." "Almost everyone," he said. There was a pause. The kind that lasts 3 seconds but feels much longer. "Do you need something?" she asked. He should have said no. He should have nodded politely and gone back to his desk and pretended he had seen nothing. That would have been the smart thing, the professional thing. Instead, he held up his glass and said, "I was making tea. Do you want some?" Morgan blinked again. Something moved across her face. Something unguarded and brief, like a flicker of light under a closed door. "I don't drink tea," she said. "I know," he replied. "I was going to make coffee." The corner of her mouth moved. Not quite a smile, but something close enough to matter. "Fine," she said quietly. "Thank you." Scott made 2 cups of coffee in an empty office at 8:30 on a Thursday night. And when he set hers on the desk in front of her, Morgan wrapped both hands around the mug like she needed something warm to hold on to. Neither of them spoke for a moment. And in that silence, Scott understood something he could not yet put into words. She was tired too. Not tired the way people are after a long day. Tired the way people are after a long time of holding something heavy completely alone. If you have ever been that person, the one who holds it all together on the outside while quietly falling apart on the inside, tell me in the comments. Because Morgan is about to show us exactly what that looks like. Something had changed. Scott could not point to the exact moment. He could not frame it or label it or file it away neatly the way he filed everything else in his carefully organized life. But after that Thursday night, something between him and Morgan was different. It was not dramatic. She did not suddenly smile at him in meetings. She did not stop being demanding or exacting or precise in the way that made lesser colleagues nervous. She was still Morgan, sharp, composed, and always 3 steps ahead of everyone else in the room. But she had stopped watching him like a problem. And Scott noticed. He noticed the morning she forwarded him a client brief with a single line at the top. "Your approach on the last one was strong. Use that instinct here. No pras. No sofnis." But coming from Morgan, those 12 words were the equivalent of a standing ovation. He noticed the afternoon she walked past his desk during a tense phone call and, without breaking stride, slid a printed document beside his keyboard. Research he had been hunting for all week. She never mentioned it. She never asked for acknowledgement. She simply saw what he needed and quietly made it easier. He noticed the way she had started to linger at the edge of conversations he was part of. Not joining, not interrupting, just present in a way she had never been before. And Scott, who had spent months feeling like a man already convicted of a crime he did not commit, found himself doing something unexpected. He started paying attention to her. Not the version of her that ran Monday briefings with the efficiency of someone who had never once questioned themselves. Not the version that delivered feedback like a surgeon, precise, clean, and emotion-free. But the other version. The one he had caught a glimpse of in that dark office with both hands wrapped around a coffee mug. He noticed that she always took the stairs, never the elevator, and always alone. He noticed that she kept a single photograph on the left corner of her desk, turned at an angle that made it impossible to see from the doorway. He noticed that she ate lunch at her desk every single day and that the lunch was always the same. Something simple, something she had clearly made herself, eaten quickly and without enjoyment, like fuel rather than pleasure. She was disciplined in a way that looked like strength from a distance. But up close, it looked a little like loneliness. One afternoon, Scott stayed late again. Lily was at a birthday party and did not need picking up until 7. He was using the extra hour at his desk when Morgan appeared in the open doorway of the small conference room he had claimed for the afternoon. "You're here late," she said. It was not an accusation this time. It was something else, something lighter. "Birthday party pickup at 7, he said. "Figured I'd use the time." Morgan leaned against the doorframe. She looked at the papers spread across the table in front of him. Then she looked at him, really looked at him, the way she had not allowed herself to before. "How old is she?" Morgan asked. Scott looked up. 6, he said. "She'll be 7 in the spring." Morgan nodded slowly. Something moved through her eyes, warm and distant at the same time, like a memory she was both reaching for and pulling back from. "She's lucky," Morgan said quietly, "to have someone who rearranges everything for her." She said it simply, without decoration, but the weight behind those words was unmistakable. Scott held her gaze for one long moment. "She's the reason I rearrange anything at all," he said. Morgan looked at him for another breath. Then she straightened, smoothed the front of her jacket, and walked away. But this time she was the one who looked back. And Scott felt something he had not felt in a very long time, seen. Not as an employee, not as a single father struggling to keep 2 lives running at once, but as a man, fully and quietly seen. That look she gave him, you know exactly what that look means. If you do, subscribe and stay with this story, because what happens next changes everything. The crisis came on a Wednesday. It always does. The worst moments never arrive on a Friday when you are already braced for the week to fall apart. They arrive mid-stride, when you are almost sure you have finally found your footing. Scott was in the middle of a team briefing when Morgan walked in with an expression he had never seen on her face before. Not anger, not disappointment, something quieter and more dangerous than both. The Callaway account, their largest client, the one that represented nearly a third of the company's annual revenue, had submitted a formal complaint. They were unhappy with the direction of the campaign. They were questioning the team's judgment. And they had requested a full presentation review within 48 hours or they were walking. The room went very still. Morgan stood at the front of the room and delivered the information the way she delivered everything. Calmly, precisely, without flinching. But Scott was watching her closely now. Closely enough to see the tension she was carrying in the line of her shoulders. Closely enough to see that behind the composure, she was holding something that felt very close to fear. The team began to panic quietly. Side glances, nervous shifting, the kind of energy that spreads through a room like smoke before anyone admits there is a fire. Scott looked down at his notes. Then he looked back up at Morgan. And he made a decision. "I'll take the lead on the revision," he said. Every head in the room turned toward him. Morgan's eyes found his. "Scott, I built the original framework," he said steadily. "I know every layer of it. Give me tonight and tomorrow morning. I'll have something ready before the client arrives." There was a pause. A long one. The kind where everyone in the room is holding their breath without realizing it. Morgan studied him. Her expression was unreadable in the way it always was when she was thinking faster than the moment could keep up with. "That is a very short window," she said carefully. "I know," Scott replied. "I work well in short windows." Something shifted in her eyes. Just barely. Just enough. "Fine," she said. "You have until 9 tomorrow morning." The meeting ended. The team scattered. Scott stayed at the table for a moment, already building the structure of the next 18 hours in his mind. He would call his mother tonight. Lily would have to sleep over again. Another conversation he would have to have gently, carefully, in the language that 6-year-olds understand. "Daddy has important work, baby. I'll be there in the morning." He hated that conversation. He had it more than he wanted to, but he picked up his pen and started writing anyway. He worked through the night. Not dramatically, not with music swelling and the camera pulling back. He worked the way real people work when something matters. Quietly, steadily, with cold coffee and tired eyes and the specific focus of someone who has learned to function on very little sleep. By 6 in the morning it was done. He sent the revised presentation to Morgan at 6:12. He did not add a message. He did not explain or qualify or apologize for any of it. He simply sent it and sat back in his chair and let it speak for itself. Her reply came 11 minutes later. 3 words. This is it. Scott stared at those 3 words for a long moment. He thought about all the mornings she had watched him walk through those glass doors like a verdict. He thought about the hallway. About I need people who show up. He set his phone face down on the desk. And for the first time in a very long time, he let himself feel it. Not pride exactly. Something quieter than that. Something that felt like finally being enough. The client meeting went perfectly. Morgan presented with her usual precision, but this time, when she referenced the revised framework, she looked directly at Scott across the conference table. Not as a boss acknowledging an employee, as someone acknowledging a person who had shown up for her when it mattered most. And Scott felt the ground shift beneath everything he thought he understood about her. He gave up a night with his daughter to save something she was quietly terrified of losing. If that hit you somewhere real like the video, this story is just getting started. The truth about Morgan came out on a Friday afternoon. Not because she chose to share it. Not because the moment was right or the timing was perfect or she had finally decided that Scott had earned it. It came out the way most buried things eventually do. Suddenly, accidentally, and at the worst possible moment. Scott was looking for a client file. Morgan had mentioned it was saved on the shared drive under a folder she had labeled with the account name. He was in her office, authorized and alone, pulling it up on her desktop while she was downstairs in a meeting that was running long. He found the folder. He opened it. And beside it, minimized but not closed, was something else entirely. A document, not a work file, not a report or a brief or a presentation draft. It was a letter, personal and unfinished, the cursor still blinking at the end of the last sentence like it had been abandoned mid-thought. Scott did not mean to read it. His eyes caught only a few lines before he straightened and looked away, his chest tightening with the immediate discomfort of having seen something he was never meant to see. But those few lines were enough. Enough to understand that Morgan had lost a child. A son. 3 years ago. Born too early and gone too soon. In the quiet and devastating way that leaves no visible mark on the outside of a person but hollows out everything within. Scott stood very still in her empty office. He thought about the photograph on her desk, the one turned at an angle so no one could see it from the doorway. He thought about the way she ate lunch alone every single day. He thought about that Thursday night, both hands wrapped around a coffee mug in the dark, that sharp, quiet breath he had almost missed. He thought about every cold glance, every clipped sentence, every moment he had stood in a hallway or a conference room feeling judged and found lacking. And suddenly, with a clarity that was almost painful, he understood. It was not him. It had never been him. Morgan watched him struggle with Lily's school pickups and sick days and empty chairs at performances, and she felt every single one of them. Not with irritation, with grief. The specific, breathtaking grief of someone who would have given anything to have those problems. To have a child who needed her to show up. To have someone small who reached for her hand in the dark. She had not been cold because she did not care. She had been cold because she cared too much and had nowhere safe to put it. Scott sat down slowly in the chair across from her desk. He was not supposed to be sitting. He was supposed to grab the file and leave. But his legs needed a moment and his chest needed longer. He thought about Lily, about the way she smelled after a bath, about the sound of her voice calling for him at 4 in the morning, about how he had spent months feeling ashamed of how much she needed him, and he felt something break open in him, quietly and completely. When Morgan returned to her office 20 minutes later, Scott was still there. He had the client file in his hand. He stood when he heard her come in. She stopped when she saw his face. She knew immediately, the way people always know when something invisible has suddenly been seen. The silence between them lasted only a few seconds, but it held everything. "Scott," she started. "You don't have to explain anything," he said gently. "Not a single thing." Morgan pressed her lips together. She looked at the window. She looked at the floor. She looked everywhere except directly at him because she knew that if she did, the composure she had spent 3 years carefully rebuilding would come apart completely. "I owe you an apology," she said finally. Her voice was steady but thin, like ice in early spring. The way I treated you was not fair. It was not professional. And it had nothing to do with your work. Scott nodded slowly. I know, he said. I know that now. Morgan finally looked at him. Her eyes were dry but unguarded in a way he had never seen before. Raw and honest and exhausted in the way that only the truth can make a person look. And Scott looked back at her with something she had not expected to find in his expression. Not pity. Not discomfort. Understanding. She had been carrying this alone for 3 years. 3 years. If your heart just broke a little for Morgan, drop a comment below. She deserves to be seen too. It was a Sunday night when everything finally broke open. Not at the office. Not under fluorescent lights with the distant sound of keyboards and the professional distance that had kept them both safe for so long. It was at Scott's front door, in the quiet of a neighborhood wrapped in early winter, the kind of cold that makes the world feel very small and very still. Morgan had texted him first. Something simple and uncharacteristic. Are you home? 3 words that must have taken her longer to send than she would ever admit. Scott had replied immediately. Yes. Come over. He did not ask why. He did not need to. He simply unlocked the front door and put the kettle on and sat at the kitchen table waiting in the particular way of someone who understands that some moments cannot be rushed. She arrived 20 minutes later. No coat heavy enough for the cold she was carrying. Her hair slightly undone. Her eyes carrying the specific weight of someone who had spent the entire drive over deciding whether to turn back. She had not turned back. Scott opened the door before she knocked. They stood in the doorway for a moment, the warm light of his home spilling out into the cold dark behind her, and neither of them said anything. Because some things have already been said in every quiet look and every unguarded moment and every cup of coffee made in an empty office at 8:30 on a Thursday night. He stepped aside. She came in. Lily was already asleep down the hall. The house was soft and warm in the way that only a home with a child in it can be. Small shoes by the door, a drawing half finished on the coffee table, a blanket folded on the couch that was clearly Lily's and clearly beloved. Morgan stood in the middle of it and looked around slowly, and something in her expression shifted in a way that was both tender and devastating, like someone pressing their hand gently against a wound they had stopped expecting to heal. Scott handed her a mug. She wrapped both hands around it. They sat together on the couch, the drawing on the coffee table between them, the quiet of the house around them, and slowly, carefully, Morgan began to talk. She told him about her son, about the 91 days he had lived and how she had memorized every one of them with the desperate precision of someone who already knew time was running out. She told him about the silence that came after, about returning to work because stillness was unbearable, about building a version of herself that was so composed and so controlled that grief simply had no place left to enter. She told him how watching Scott had undone her, not because he was doing anything wrong, but because he was doing everything she had dreamed of, imperfectly, exhaustedly, completely. Scott listened. He did not try to fix it. He did not offer words that could not possibly be adequate. He simply stayed, present and steady and real in the way that matters most when everything else has fallen away. When Morgan finally went quiet, the room held them both gently. Then she set her mug down, and she reached for his hand in the soft dark of that small warm living room. Her fingers found his, and she held on. Stay with me, she whispered. Not a command, not a plea. Something between the two, fragile and brave and completely honest. Not forever. Just don't go anywhere yet. Scott looked down at her hand in his. He thought about every morning he had walked through those glass doors feeling invisible. He thought about every night he had sat at Lily's bedside choosing to stay when leaving would have been easier. He thought about how the bravest thing a person can do is reach for something real when everything inside them is afraid. He turned his hand over and held hers back. I'm not going anywhere, he said quietly. And he meant it in every way a person can mean something. Morgan leaned her head against his shoulder. Scott did not move. Outside, the winter night pressed gently against the windows. Down the hall, Lily slept peacefully, unaware that something beautiful and necessary had just quietly begun. There was no grand declaration, no perfectly chosen words, just 2 people, broken in different ways, brave in different ways, choosing each other in the stillness of an ordinary Sunday night. And sometimes that is the whole story. Sometimes that is the best one. If the story reminded you that the most important things are almost never said out loud, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. And if you stayed until the very end, you already know why Scott and Morgan found each other. Because people who refuse to stop showing up always do.